The loudest band on earth was dying in absolute silence. Behind the wall of amplifiers, Deep Purple wasn't a brotherhood. It was a multi-million-dollar meat grinder. They sold anthems of freedom to millions. But on stage, they were heavily traumatized assets locked in a vicious civil war. They weaponized volume to physically break their own singer. They executed ruthless backroom purges. And they kept the music playing while their bandmates rotted from heroin addiction right under the spotlight. This wasn't a rock band. It was a masterclass in acoustic warfare and mutual destruction. The blueprint for this carnage was drafted in the corporate office. The management strategy was simple and ruthless. Exhaust their labor. In 1970 alone, Deep Purple was forced to perform nearly 150 shows across continents, not to mention the hours they spent locked in recording studios. They generated millions of dollars, but were treated like contract slaves with no control over their own schedules. The price of the title, The Loudest Band on the Planet, was paid with singer Ian Gillan's throat. To avoid being overwhelmed by Ritchie Blackmore's massive amplifiers, Gillan had to scream beyond his biological limits. After each performance of the epic Child in Time, he would often feel the taste of fresh blood rising in his throat. Because management forbade canceling shows, Gillan resorted to drinking like a madman, not to enjoy the rock and roll style, but as a cheap anesthetic to forget the excruciating pain in his vocal cords before picking up the microphone again. Meanwhile, guitarist Ritchie Blackmore coped with exhaustion through authoritarianism. Unable to resist his manager's schedule, he turned to controlling those around him. Blackmore turned silence into a weapon, traveling in his own car, going on stage, and then immediately leaving without a second thought. He established a kind of hidden power. In this band, he was untouchable. The rest were all replaceable. But Gillan, with the proud ego of a leader, refused to bow. This toxicity reached its peak in December 1971 in Montreux, Switzerland. The masterpiece Machine Head, featuring its immortal hit Smoke on the Water, was not at all the culmination of artistic brilliance. It was a laborious task. 5 exhausted men divided into factions were forced to churn out an album in a freezing hotel hallway, recording quickly just to escape each other's sight. Ironically, Machine Head's immense success did not save them. It only accelerated the exploitative machine. Pushed into an endless tour of America in 1972, the hostile silence in the dressing room officially spilled out into the open. The performance stage, a place meant for music, became a brutal battleground where guitarists and singers openly sabotaged each other in front of tens of thousands of spectators. Blackmore, knowing that Gillan relied on being able to hear the underlying rhythm to pitch his high notes, began deliberately manipulating the stage volume. Armed with custom-modified Marshall amplifiers, Blackmore would intentionally dial up his volume to excruciating levels specifically during Gillan's vocal sections. This was not a pursuit of a heavier sound. It was a targeted acoustic assault designed to drown out the lead singer. Gillan refused to yield. When Blackmore pushed the volume, Gillan weaponized his remaining stamina, pushing his already damaged vocal cords into a dangerous overdrive. The audience perceived this as raw heavy metal energy. In reality, they were witnessing mutual destruction. When sheer volume was not enough, Blackmore resorted to rhythmic sabotage. During instrumental sections where Gillan was expected to join back in, Blackmore would intentionally alter the tempo, playing slightly out of time or extending a solo far beyond its agreed-upon length, leaving Gillan stranded at the microphone looking foolish. Gillan retaliated by openly mocking Blackmore's mood swings to the press and ignoring Blackmore's musical cues on stage. The collateral damage of this war fell on the remaining three members. Bassist Roger Glover, a pragmatic musician who had co-written much of their material with Gillan, found himself caught in the crossfire, increasingly targeted by Blackmore's contempt simply by association. Drummer Ian Pace kept his head down, focusing mechanically on maintaining the rhythm, effectively building a psychological wall around his drum kit. Keyboardist John Lord, the oldest and most classically educated member, attempted to act as the diplomat. Lord recognized that the band was generating unprecedented wealth, but he also saw that the HEC management structure offered zero psychological support. The band was a cash cow, and as long as they showed up to the arenas, management ignored the internal rot. Lord's attempts to mediate between Blackmore and Gillan were entirely futile. You cannot reason with two men who are suffering from clinical exhaustion and profound mutual hatred. By the end of 1972, Deep Purple had conquered the world. They had the records, the money, and the Guinness certification. But behind the doors of their separate hotel rooms, the men who built the empire were barely speaking. The machine had consumed their physical health, and the battle for the steering wheel was about to cause a catastrophic, permanent fracture. The purges were about to begin. The hatred that tore Deep Purple apart in 1973 didn't come out of nowhere. It was built into the band's foundation. From the very beginning, loyalty meant nothing. Ritchie Blackmore controlled the band through a simple, ruthless tactic. If someone wasn't useful anymore, he fired them behind their back. The blueprint for this ruthlessness was drafted early. In the summer of 1969, loyalty was already a dead concept. Before they were the loudest heavy metal band on earth, Deep Purple was a moderately successful psychedelic pop act, heavily reliant on their hit cover of Joe South's Hush, This It. Oration, known as Mark I, featured original vocalist Rod Evans and bassist Nick Simper. They had toured extensively, built the foundation of the brand, and generated the initial capital that kept HEC Enterprises afloat. Management had already instituted a punishing, relentless itinerary. The Mark I lineup was shoved into an endless cycle of club dates, television appearances, and grueling cross-country drives in cramped vans across America to capitalize on their fleeting radio success. Evans and Simper were bleeding for the brand, exhausting themselves nightly under the assumption that they were equal partners in a shared artistic brotherhood. They were entirely unaware that their immense physical labor was merely funding the search for their own replacements. However, as the decade closed, the musical landscape shifted aggressively. The debut of Led Zeppelin signaled that the future of rock was heavy, blues-driven, and highly amplified. For Ritchie Blackmore, this shift was not merely a change in sonic trends. It was a prime opportunity to seize absolute dictatorial control and initiate the band's first major internal civil war. Blackmore despised the pop crooner aesthetic of Mark I. He recognized that a band with a traditional charismatic pop frontman like Rod Evans naturally ceded visual and social power to the singer. Blackmore wanted the power entirely concentrated in his amplifier stacks. Keyboardist John Lord, equally ambitious and recognizing that their current pop-leaning sound was rapidly becoming commercially obsolete, aligned himself with the guitarist. Together they made a ruthless executive decision. Evans, with his traditional vocal style, and Simper, a competent but conventional bassist, were deemed defective hardware. They weren't just musically incompatible, they were obstacles in Blackmore's calculated power grab. He did not want co-founders, he wanted subordinates. By orchestrating their removal, Blackmore was actively establishing a hierarchy where singers and bassists were merely replaceable contractors servicing his riffs. The 1969 dismissals set a harsh precedent due to the absolute secrecy of the operation. There was no open discussion, no band meeting, and no professional courtesy. Blackmore and Lord, entirely backed by management, decided to execute the transition in total secrecy. They actively scouted and recruited Ian Gillan and Roger Glover from the band Episode 6. For weeks, a surreal and deeply deceptive psychological operation took place, exacerbated by the sheer shackling weight of their touring commitments. What followed was a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization and corporate cruelty. During the sweltering days, Blackmore, Lord, and drummer Ian Pace would secretly convene at the Hanwell Community Centre in London. Here they meticulously stripped away the psychedelic pop and rehearsed the heavy, aggressive new material with Gillan and Glover, forging the blueprint for their massive future success. But at night, the relentless touring machine demanded its pound of flesh. Because management flatly refused to cancel contracted gigs and lose a single dollar of ticket revenue, Blackmore, Lord, and Pace were forced to continue performing with the Mark I lineup. The physical and mental exhaustion of this dual existence was staggering. They would spend 8 hours writing heavy metal in a community center, then immediately pile into a cramped transit van with Rod Evans and Nick Simper to play pop songs at a sweaty club. They shared tiny, unventilated dressing rooms. They ate meals together. They looked their founding members in the eye, shared jokes, played the shows, and collected the paychecks, all while knowing they had already signed their professional death warrants. It was an environment of suffocating paranoia, where smiles were weapons and silence was a confession. The grueling pace of the live shows provided the perfect cover. Everyone was too biologically depleted and physically drained from the road to notice the conspiracy gestating right beside them on stage. Blackmore and Lord endured the severe sleep deprivation because the prize was absolute control. They coldly viewed their bandmates not as brothers in arms, but as depreciating assets waiting to be liquidated. When the news was finally delivered, it was devoid of any human empathy. It was not handled by the musicians who had shared the stage and the sweat. It was cowardly delegated to management. Evans and Simper were abruptly cut off from the brand they helped to build, discarded with minimal severance, and effectively erased from the band's forward momentum. This calculated execution permanently encoded paranoia into the DNA of Deep Purple. It established a terrifying baseline. Physical exhaustion, performance, and loyalty could not save you from a backroom corporate execution. When Ian Gillan and Roger Glover officially joined to form the highly lucrative Mark II lineup, they entered fully aware of the established corporate culture. They knew exactly how the machine operated. You are only valuable as long as Richie Blackmore deems you useful. If you fall out of favor, you will not be confronted. You will simply be replaced behind your back. Deep Purple was no longer a band. It was a hostile merger, temporarily held together by multi-million-dollar royalty checks. By 1973, the Mark II lineup had conquered the globe, but the physical and psychological toll of the relentless touring schedule had completely eroded whatever fragile alliance existed. The environment within Deep Purple was no longer merely suffocating. It had mutated into a highly pressurized, toxic battlefield where musical performance was secondary to a brutal, ongoing civil war for absolute power. They had accumulated staggering wealth, gold records, and the adulation of millions. Yet the 5 men operating the machine were trapped in a state of terminal exhaustion. As the war between guitarist Richie Bell, Ackmore, and vocalist Ian Gillan reached its destructive peak, the band ceased to function as a creative entity. Instead, it became a claustrophobic arena where a battle for the ultimate role of the leader was waged nightly. Blackmore, the architect of the band's heavy sonic foundation, realized he needed to reassert his dominance over the entire organization. He viewed the band as his personal fiefdom. However, Gillan, fortified by his own massive ego, his undeniable charisma as a frontman, and the critical acclaim heaped upon his multi-octave vocal performances, was entirely too stubborn to submit to Blackmore's intimidation tactics. Gillan knew that his face and his voice were the primary conduits to the audience. He was the undisputed star of the live shows, and he wielded that influence as a shield. Therefore, recognizing that a direct frontal assault on the lead singer would be commercially disastrous, Blackmore shifted his crosshairs to a more vulnerable strategic target, bassist Roger Glover. Roger Glover was the undisputed workhorse of Deep Purple. He was a pragmatic, highly prolific songwriter, heavily responsible for structuring the band's most iconic sprawling jams into concise, radio-friendly hits, including the legendary arrangement of Smoke on the Water. He possessed a structural musical intelligence that grounded Blackmore's erratic genius. Furthermore, Glover was the only stabilizing human force within the group, an innate diplomat who frequently acted as a crucial buffer between the warring factions of the guitarist and the vocalist. But to Richie Blackmore, operating within the rigid confines of an authoritarian complex, Glover's primary and unforgivable offense was his unwavering loyalty to Ian Gillan. The two men had joined Deep Purple together from the pop band Episode 6. They shared a deep pre-existing brotherhood, and they frequently collaborated on lyrics, vocal melodies, and song structures. Blackmore, operating with a highly insular, a deeply suspicious and paranoid mindset, viewed Glover not as a vital musical contributor, but as a dangerous extension of Gillan's political influence within the band. Glover was Gillan's power base. To break Gillan's power and permanently destabilize his rival's psychological footing within the group, Blackmore calculated with military precision that he needed to sever his primary ally. Blackmore's method of forcing Glover out was a masterclass in psychological warfare. It was simple, insidious, and devastatingly effective. Complete freezing silence. He didn't yell, he didn't throw objects, he didn't engage in theatrical dressing room arguments. During the fractured recording sessions for the Who Do We Think We Are album in late 1972, sessions miserably split between a rented villa in Rome and a studio in Frankfurt, Blackmore simply stopped acknowledging the bassist's existence. The band's internal communication entirely collapsed. The atmosphere became a suffocating vacuum. The title of the album itself, Who Do We Think We Are, was a cynical, sarcastic reflection of their massively inflated egos and their total glaring lack of unity. The recording process transformed into a mechanical, joyless, and intensely hostile procedure. The band members flatly refused to inhabit the studio at the same time. The producer, Martin Birch, was reduced from a creative collaborator to a highly stressed, hostile negotiator, physically carrying heavy analog tapes down cold corridors between Blackmore and Gillan, who were actively operating on entirely different, meticulously planned schedules solely to avoid making eye contact with one another. Inside the studio, Blackmore didn't argue with Glover over bass lines or tempos. He simply treated him as if he were already a ghost. He refused to play rhythm guitar tracks behind Glover's bass parts. He would sit in the control room, staring at the bassist through the studio glass with open, silent contempt. Glover, a man who had co-writ 10, the band's biggest, most lucrative anthems, suddenly found himself utterly isolated, subjected to a daily regime of unspoken emotional abuse. The relentless daily stress of this silent, freezing hostility tore at Glover's nervous system. The anxiety of walking into a workspace where the primary instrumentalist refused to look at him or speak his name manifested in severe physical trauma, eventually causing Glover to develop chronic, agonizing stomach ulcers. Blackmore's final move in this internal coup was cold, swift, and entirely decisive. Recognizing his own absolute leverage as the primary riff writer, he bypassed his bandmates entirely, walked directly into the management office, and delivered a non-negotiable corporate ultimatum. If he doesn't go, I go. For the management at HEC Enterprises, this was not a matter of brotherhood, artistic integrity, or loyalty. It was a remarkably simple, cold-blooded math problem. Blackmore's heavy, aggressive guitar riffs paid the massive operational bills. He was the sonic signature of the brand. Glover, despite his massive songwriting contributions, was deemed a replaceable rhythmic component. Roger Glover was immediately, unceremoniously fired. Glover was a brilliant songwriter and a stabilizing human element in a band losing its humanity. However, Blackmore's guitar riffs were the primary commercial engine. Without his heavy blues rock architecture, the touring machine would instantly stall. The business decision was instantaneous and devoid of moral consideration. Management entirely sided with the asset that generated the highest revenue. There was absolutely no loyalty afforded to the man who had co-written their greatest global commercial triumphs. Glover was coldly informed by management, not by his peers, that his services were no longer required. The blatant injustice of his termination, being fired not for musical incompetence, not for missing a show, but simply because the lead guitarist weaponized his own ego and refused to be in the same room with him, was a devastating, paralyzing blow to Glover's psychological well-being and his professional self-esteem. By the summer of 1973, the internal purges had successfully achieved Blackmore's primary destructive objective: absolute organizational destabilization. Roger Glover was effectively forced out, discarded as acceptable collateral damage in a vicious war of egos. Ian Gillan, forced to stand by and watch his closest friend and most trusted ally be unceremoniously discarded by management, recognized the chilling reality of his own situation. Furthermore, Gillan was completely, biologically drained. The vocal trauma inflicted by the ruthless, unending touring schedule had pushed his body to the absolute brink of collapse. He realized with terrifying clarity that the corporate machine of Deep Purple would not stop until it eventually killed him. Choosing self-preservation over the illusion of rock stardom, he preemptively submitted his resignation, officially giving management a legally mandated 6-month notice to fulfill existing highly lucrative touring obligations. The final shows of the Deep Purple Mark II lineup leading up to June 1973 were not a triumphant, celebratory farewell of rock legends. They were the grim, agonizing, mechanical obligations of 5 heavily traumatized men who openly despised each other, playing out the clock on a multi-million-dollar contractual trap. The corporate legal entity of Deep Purple had survived the internal war, but the human beings trapped inside its architecture had been completely hollowed out. And as management frantically scrambled to find suitable, marketable replacements to keep the massive touring revenue flowing, they were preparing to drag new, younger, highly vulnerable musicians into a toxic, pressurized vacuum that would ultimately prove to be fatal. When Ian Gillan quit in the summer of 1973, it wasn't a calculated, strategic career move to launch a highly publicized Ed solo venture. He was simply desperately trying to survive. By the time he handed in his official notice, the relentless, punishing velocity of the touring schedule had physically and mentally broken him down to a cellular level. Management hadn't just worked him to the bone, they had actively, systematically pushed his biological frame until his vital organs began shutting down. And when he could barely stand upright in the dressing room or summon the breath to sing, the executives and promoters didn't see a fragile human being in desperate need of an ambulance and extended medical care. They only saw a highly expensive potential breach of contract. Deep Purple's heavily marketed status as the loudest band in the world came with a severe, agonizing physical cost, and that toll was almost entirely borne by the mucosal tissues of the lead vocalist. In the early 1970s, the technology for live sound reproduction was highly unbalanced and primitively dangerous. Amplifiers for guitars and basses had evolved rapidly to project massive, concussive walls of distorted sound across vast, cavernous arenas. But stage monitoring for vocalists remained dangerously, pathetically inadequate. Ritchie Blackmore, operating with his custom-modified 200-watt Marshall major stacks, regularly and intentionally pushed the stage volume far past the threshold of human physical pain, using acoustic warfare as a means of dominating the stage. To simply hear the pitch of his own voice, let alone project it over the surrounding, deafening acoustic assault, Gillan was forced to force his delicate vocal tract far beyond its natural, structural, biological limits. For Ian Gillan, between 1970 and 1973, there was absolutely no recovery period. HEC Enterprises operated on a ruthless, mechanized model of perpetual revenue generation. If a grueling cross-country tour ended in the United States, another grueling tour immediately commenced in Europe, closely followed by mandatory, high-pressure, EP-deprived studio sessions. Gillan was expected to deliver high-register, blood-curdling screams, regardless of his deteriorating physical condition. On nights when his voice was physically bleeding, when his vocal cords were severely inflamed to the point of acute laryngitis, management adamantly did not cancel the shows. Canceling a show meant refunding massive ticket sales and facing catastrophic financial penalties for breaching promoter contracts. Instead, Gillan was pumped full of adrenaline, given minimal first aid, and pushed out into the blinding lights. He became heavily, dangerously reliant on hard alcohol to aggressively numb the physical, agonizing pain of tearing his own throat apart before violently grabbing the microphone again. The machine demanded its performance, and it did not care if the engine bled. This sustained, horrific physical trauma was heavily compounded by the incredibly toxic, paranoid, psychological environment fostered by Ritchie Blackmore. Blackmore had isolated himself entirely from Gillan. He communicated his disgust and his desire for dominance only through deliberate, calculated acts of musical sabotage on stage, intentionally altering tempos and pushing his volume to drown out the singer. Gillan was therefore trapped in a maddening paradox. He was the essential, recognizable frontman of a multi-million-dollar global empire, the voice that sold the records. Yet he was treated with open, silent contempt by his lead guitarist and viewed merely as a depreciating biological asset by his management. The immense, shackling stress of this hostile workplace manifested in severe, crippling insomnia, chronic fatigue syndrome, and a total terrifying depletion of his central nervous system. When Gillan finally submitted his official letter of resignation in late 1972, management's response was highly indicative of their ruthless, unyielding corporate ethos. They did not express concern. They did not offer him a sabbatical or much-needed leave to repair his hemorrhaging vocal cords. Instead, they dispatched their lawyers. They enforced the strictest, most punitive interpretation of his contract, legally compelling him, under threat of complete financial ruin, to fulfill a grueling, agonizing 6-month notice period. He was completely trapped. The final 6 months of the Deep Purple Mark II lineup constitute one of the most grim, tension-filled, and agonizing farewell tours in the entire history of rock music. It was a prolonged death march. Gillan was legally forced to continue sharing cramped stages, tense dressing rooms, and claustrophobic transit vehicles with Ritchie Blackmore, a man he now actively, intensely despised. Worse still, he had to perform these grueling shows, knowing his closest ally, bassist Roger Glover, had just been secretly marked for termination by Blackmore and management, forced to play out his own final days in the band entirely unaware of his impending doom until the very end. The atmosphere was completely, irreversibly poisoned. The climax of this agonizing, soul-crushing contractual obligation occurred during the band's highly anticipated Japanese tour in June 1973. Japan was a massive, incredibly lucrative market for Deep Purple, and management had aggressively booked a dense string of massive arena dates to extract the maximum possible capital before the lineup officially fractured. By the time they finally reached Osaka for the final performances, Ian Gillan was practically a walking ghost. He was entirely, biologically drained, his eyes hollow, his throat a ruined wasteland of scar tissue. He executed the set list entirely on muscle memory and sheer grit. There was absolutely no interaction between the musicians on stage. The visual representation of the band was a chilling testament to their internal decay. Blackmore stood rigidly on one side of the stage, his body physically turned entirely away from the vocalist, refusing to acknowledge his existence. Meanwhile, Gillan delivered his final agonizing screams to the rapturous Japanese audience, fueled only by the desperate singular knowledge that his tenure in this unforgiving corporate grinder was finally ending. After the final chord faded in Osaka, Gillan walked off the stage, severed all contact with the band, and effectively vanished from the music industry for years, requiring extensive physical rehabilitation and psychological decompression just to function as a normal human being again. With Gillan and Glover officially purged, a normal band might have paused to reassess, but the touring contracts for 1974 were already signed. Driven by the desperate need to maintain momentum, management immediately formed the Mark III lineup, dragging fresh, highly vulnerable personnel into the exact same environment that had just destroyed its previous occupants. The recruitment process for the new members highlights the band's predatory dynamic. To replace Roger Glover, they hired Glenn Hughes, the bassist and vocalist from the funk rock band Trapeze. Hughes was young, immensely talented, and entirely unprepared for the sheer scale and internal coldness of the Deep Purple machine. To replace Ian Gillan, they took an even bigger gamble. They hired David Coverdale, a 21-year-old retail worker who had been singing in obscure local pub bands. Coverdale was plucked from absolute obscurity, handed a microphone, and dropped directly into the center of a global touring empire. Management framed this as a Cinderella story, but the reality was far more cynical. Coverdale and Hughes were cheap, hungry, and easily controllable. They had no leverage. They were stepping into a hierarchy absolutely dominated by Ritchie Blackmore, whose dictatorial control had only solidified after successfully executing the ouster of Gillan and Glover. The new recruits were not equal partners. They were employees contracted to service the Blackmore architecture. The Mark III machine launched with the album Burn in early 1974, and the touring schedule immediately resumed its punishing, illogical pace. If the environment under Gillan had been defined by passive-aggressive silence, the environment under Coverdale and Hughes became defined by massive, unchecked excess and severe megalomania. The infusion of massive wealth and the sudden global fame placed on the young recruits acted as a catalyst for a new breed of toxicity. The sheer scale of the machine during this era is best exemplified by the infamous California Jam Festival in April 1974. Deep Purple was booked to co-headline the festival at the Ontario Motor Speedway in front of an estimated 250,000 people. This was not a concert. It was a massive, highly synchronized corporate broadcast, heavily sponsored and filmed by the ABC television network. It was here that the complete psychological detachment of Ritchie Blackmore and the unmanageable nature of the Deep Purple machine were broadcast to the world. Blackmore had developed an absolute contempt for authority, promoters, and the media. A dispute arose backstage regarding the exact time Deep Purple was scheduled to perform. The festival was running ahead of schedule, and the ABC television directors demanded that the band take the stage before sunset to ensure optimal lighting for the broadcast. Blackmore flatly refused. He locked himself in his trailer, stating he would only play at dusk as originally contracted to maximize the visual impact of his light show. The festival organizers panicked. The ABC network executives threatened to cancel the broadcast, pull the band's fee, and initiate massive lawsuits. Blackmore did not care. He weaponized his silence and his refusal to cooperate, paralyzing a 250,000-person event to assert his dominance. When Blackmore finally agreed to take the stage at his preferred hour, his performance was a display of calculated physical violence that bordered on criminal negligence. Fueled by rage at the television networks and a profound detachment from the reality of his actions, Blackmore decided to physically destroy the ABC camera equipment. During the climax of the song Space Truckin', an ABC cameraman moved between Blackmore and the audience to secure a close-up shot. Blackmore, without hesitation, rammed the head of his Fender Stratocaster guitar directly into the heavy lens of the television camera, shattering it and physically assaulting the operator. This was not a spontaneous act of rock and roll rebellion. It was a violent assertion of control by a man operating in an environment with zero accountability. Blackmore then proceeded to smash several of his guitars, throwing the debris into the crowd. He then signaled his road crew to ignite a pyrotechnic charge hidden inside his amplifier stacks. The crew, acting under the extreme pressure of Blackmore's demands, had severely overloaded the explosives. The resulting detonation was massive. It blew a hole in the stage, sent shrapnel flying, and generated a fireball that briefly engulfed the drum riser. Drummer Ian Pace was nearly blown off his stool, his glasses knocked off his face by the shockwave, while Blackmore stood at the edge of the stage, calmly observing the destruction he had orchestrated. The band had to be smuggled out of the venue via helicopter immediately after the set to avoid arrest by the California Highway Patrol and the local fire marshals. The California Jam incident is historically significant because it proves that by 1974, Deep Purple was completely out of control. Management could book the shows and collect the checks, but they had absolutely no authority over the psychological state of their primary asset. The corporate touring machine had funded a monster, and that monster was now operating with total impunity. However, the paradox of Ritchie Blackmore's absolute control was that it ultimately alienated him from his own creation. Coverdale and Hughes, growing more confident with their global success, began to heavily inject funk and soul influences into the band's music, leading to the 1974 album Stormbringer. Blackmore despised this musical direction. He was a purist who demanded aggressive, classically influenced hard rock. He found himself in a band he had systematically purged to gain control over, only to realize the new employees were steering the music in a direction he abhorred. Rather than engage in another drawn-out war of attrition, Blackmore chose the ultimate act of corporate abandonment. In the spring of 1975, he quietly informed management that he was leaving Deep Purple to form his own band, Rainbow. He fulfilled his remaining touring obligations with characteristic coldness, refusing to speak to Coverdale or Hughes, and walked away from the empire he had built. Blackmore's departure should have been the definitive end of Deep Purple. The primary architect, the dictator, and the core of their signature sound was gone. A rational business entity would have dissolved the corporation, divided the assets, and allowed the remaining members to move on. But HEC Enterprises was not a rational entity. It was a revenue engine. The Deep Purple brand name still held massive global value. There were still untapped markets, unfulfilled promoter contracts, and millions of dollars to be extracted from the fan base. Management and the remaining members, Lord, Pace, Coverdale, and Hughes, made a fatal corporate decision. They decided to keep the machine running. To do so, they needed to find a replacement for Ritchie Blackmore. They needed a guitarist who could step into the shoes of a legend, play the massive back catalog, and withstand the shackling toxic pressure of the Deep Purple touring schedule. They found their replacement in America. His name was Tommy Bolin. Bolin was an incredibly gifted 24-year-old guitarist from Sioux City, Iowa. He possessed a fluid, jazz-infused style that had earned him critical acclaim in bands like Zephyr and the James Gang, and through his brilliant session work on Billy Cobham's jazz fusion masterpiece Spectrum. Bolin was a musical prodigy, capable of breathtaking improvisation and deep emotional resonance on the fretboard. However, beneath the musical genius, Tommy Bolin was highly fragile. He was a deeply sensitive individual who lacked the thick skin and aggressive ego required to survive the predatory highest tiers of the rock industry. More critically, Bolin was already fighting a severe, escalating battle with narcotics, specifically a heavy addiction to heroin. He was a young man in desperate need of a supportive environment, medical intervention, and a stable schedule. Instead, he was recruited into Deep Purple. Recruiting Tommy Bolin in 1975 placed a highly vulnerable musician into a deeply unstable environment. It was a catastrophic miscalculation that highlights the complete lack of basic human empathy within the band's operational structure. Management saw a highly competent contractor who could keep the brand alive. They willfully ignored or completely failed to investigate the severe psychological and chemical vulnerabilities of the asset they were purchasing. When Bolin signed the contract, he was not just inheriting a guitar position. He was inheriting a massive toxic legacy. He was stepping into an environment defined by extreme wealth, massive egos, and a total lack of internal discipline. With Blackmore gone, the power vacuum within the band was rapidly filled by the escalating drug and alcohol abuse of the remaining members, particularly Glenn Hughes, whose own cocaine addiction was spiraling out of control. Furthermore, Bolin was inheriting the absolute hostility of the Deep Purple fan base. The audiences who bought tickets in 1975 and 1976 did not come to see a jazz fusion prodigy. They came to see the man in black, Ritchie Blackmore. When they saw a flamboyant, feather-wearing American step onto the stage, their reaction was visceral and unforgiving. Bolin was subjected to intense acoustic abuse from the crowds. He was booed, spat upon, and constantly heckled with demands for Blackmore. The pressure of trying to perform technically demanding music while facing thousands of hostile fans every night was a psychological tragedy. Bolin did not possess the aggressive arrogance of Ian Gillan or the cold detachment of Ritchie Blackmore to fight back. He internalized the rejection. To cope with the immense stress of the global touring schedule, the hostility of the audience, and the chaotic, drug-fueled environment of his own bandmates, Bolin retreated entirely into his addiction. The Deep Purple machine, which had previously run on the cold, mechanical efficiency of Blackmore's dictatorship, now devolved into a chaotic, chemical nightmare. The touring apparatus continued to push them across the globe, from the United States to Japan to the UK, but the structural integrity of the band was completely disintegrating. The management, true to their historical form, did nothing to intervene. As long as Bolin could physically stand on stage and play the riffs to Smoke on the Water and Highway Star, the machine kept grinding forward. The corporate mandate remained unchanged. Fulfill the contracts, collect the revenue, and ignore the human cost. They were extracting the final drops of blood from a franchise that was rapidly accelerating toward a fatal crash. The recruitment of Tommy Bolin in 1975 was intended to be a corporate rescue operation for HEC Enterprises. Deep Purple, as a financial entity, was bleeding momentum after the departure of its central architect, Ritchie Blackmore. The strategy was to inject a young, brilliant American guitarist into the framework, record a new album, and immediately reactivate the global touring machine. The resulting album, Come Taste the Band, was a surprisingly competent record, masking the profound internal decay of the group. But the studio environment is a controlled quarantine. The true measure of a band's structural integrity is the road. When the Deep Purple Mark IV lineup launched its world tour in late 1975, the quarantine was breached, and the operation rapidly degenerated into one of the most chaotic, drug-addled, and physically dangerous tours in the history of rock music. The internal power dynamic of Deep Purple had fundamentally shifted, and not for the better. Under Blackmore, the toxicity was defined by a cold, calculated dictatorship and silent psychological warfare. Under the new regime, the toxicity was defined by anarchy, fueled by an unlimited budget and massive quantities of Class A narcotics. The battle for leadership was no longer a cold war between a guitarist and a singer. It was a fractured, multi-directional conflict. Glenn Hughes, the bassist and co-vocalist, had developed a severe, debilitating addiction to cocaine. The drug completely warped his perception of his role within the band. Hughes began to view himself not as the bassist, but as the primary frontman and star of the franchise. He extended his vocal improvisations on stage to agonizing lengths, openly stepping over David Coverdale, the actual lead singer. Coverdale, who had been elevated from retail obscurity just 2 years prior, found himself isolated and infuriated, fighting for acoustic space against his own bassist. The stage, which should have been the focal point of their musical execution, became a platform for chemically induced ego trips. Meanwhile, John Lord and Ian Pace, the last remaining founding members and the stabilizing rhythmic foundation of the band, retreated into professional detachment. They were seasoned veterans, watching their multi-million-dollar corporate empire burn to the ground, helpless to stop the erratic behavior of Hughes and the escalating heroin addiction of Bolin. Communication effectively ceased. The band members traveled in separate limousines, stayed in separate floors of hotels, and only interacted when physically forced. Into the stage. They were 5 independent contractors operating under a shared corporate logo, bound together solely by contractual obligations and the sheer velocity of the touring schedule. That schedule, dictated by a management team entirely detached from the biological and psychological reality of its musicians, pushed the band into actively hostile and physically dangerous territories. In December 1975, management booked the band for a 2-night residency at the Senayan Utama Stadium in Jakarta, Indonesia. At the time, the country was under a military dictatorship. It was a highly volatile political environment, far outside the standard rock touring circuit. Management negotiated a lucrative deal with a local syndicate tied to the military apparatus. Contracted to play a 20,000-seat arena, the band arrived to find the syndicate had oversold the stadium to 100,000 people per night, backed by armed soldiers and attack dogs. When Deep Purple's security team questioned the missing ticket money, the syndicate responded with lethal violence. Patsy Collins, a trusted bodyguard and close friend of the band, died under highly suspicious circumstances. His body was found at the bottom of an elevator shaft at their hotel. Any normal management team would have immediately evacuated the band. Deep Purple's management, terrified of losing money and facing the military syndicate, did the opposite. On the second night, grieving and in genuine fear for their lives, the band was marched to the stadium at gunpoint. They were ordered to play. Ian Pace hit the drums mechanically, John Lord stared blankly ahead, and a terrified, drug-impaired Tommy Bolin stumbled through the riffs. They were no longer rock stars, they were hostages, forced to play heavy metal for the very people who had just murdered their friend. When they were finally allowed to leave Indonesia, after the syndicate extorted a massive portion of their touring equipment and fees, the band was fundamentally broken. The Jakarta incident completely shattered any remaining illusion of camaraderie or purpose. But the corporate touring machine does not acknowledge trauma. The itinerary was set. From the nightmare of Indonesia, they were immediately flown to Japan for the next leg of the tour. It was in Japan that the physical toll of the machine finally caught up with Tommy Bolin in a catastrophic public manner. Bolin's heroin addiction had compromised his immune system and his physical coordination. Prior to the first major Japanese concert at the Budokan in Tokyo, an incident occurred that effectively ended his ability to function as a professional guitarist. The official narrative fed to the press by management was that Bolin had fallen asleep on his left arm after an exhausting flight, causing a temporary pinched nerve. The grim, unvarnished reality, widely corroborated by crew members and insiders, was that Bolin had administered a bad heroin injection into his left arm, causing severe nerve damage and rendering his fretting hand almost entirely paralyzed. For a lead guitarist in a hard rock band, this was a terminal physical failure. Bolin literally could not grip the neck of his Fender Stratocaster. He could not form chords or execute the complex, high-speed solos required of the Deep Purple catalog. Faced with a medically incapacitated musician, standard protocol demands immediate cancellation. Deep Purple's management refused. The Budokan was sold out. Canceling meant losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue and facing massive penalties from the Japanese promoters. Management issued a chilling directive. Bolin goes on stage regardless of his physical state. He was shoved directly into the Budokan spotlight with a dead left arm. To conceal the disaster, Jon Lord altered his Hammond organ to mimic a distorted guitar, playing Bolin's solos on the keys. Bolin simply stood center stage, weakly strumming open strings with his right hand, pantomiming his own performing in C. The Japanese audience, highly attuned to the band's catalog and expecting the technical brilliance of the Deep Purple legacy, immediately recognized the deception. They realized they were watching a crippled addict and a keyboardist desperately trying to cover up a medical emergency. The crowd turned hostile. Bolin was subjected to intense acoustic abuse, booed and mocked by thousands of fans. The psychological degradation of standing on a world-class stage, entirely unable to execute his craft, while his bandmates frantically tried to cover for his physical failure, accelerated Bolin's downward spiral into total chemical dependency. Despite the disaster in Japan, management pushed them into a massive tour of the United States, followed by a final run in the United Kingdom. The tour became a death march, forcing 5 biologically shattered men across international borders just to fulfill contractual obligations. The U.S. leg was a chaotic blur of erratic performances. Some nights, bolstered by a massive influx of cocaine, the band would lock into a ferocious, aggressive groove. Other nights, Bolin would be so incapacitated he could barely stand, and Hughes would completely derail the timing of the songs with endless, self-indulgent vocal rants. Coverdale grew increasingly despondent, realizing his dream gig had mutated into a toxic prison sentence. The ultimate collapse occurred during the UK tour in March 1976. The British audiences, fiercely loyal to the classic Blackmore/Gillan era, were entirely unforgiving of the chaotic, funk-infused mess that Mark IV presented on stage. The crowds openly rebelled, chanting for Blackmore and throwing objects at Bolin and Hughes. The breaking point arrived on March 15, 1976, at the Liverpool Empire Theatre. It was not a dramatic, explosive finale. It was a pathetic, exhausted whimper. The performance was a disjointed, agonizing failure. The communication between the members had completely evaporated. Hughes was operating in a different temporal reality. Bolin was physically and mentally checked out, and Coverdale was at the end of his emotional tether. During the encore, David Coverdale, the young man who had been handed the keys to the kingdom 3 years prior, finally broke. Overwhelmed by the sheer toxicity of the environment, the hostility of the crowd, and the realization that the band had become a mockery of its former self, Coverdale walked off the stage in tears. He retreated to his dressing room, locked the door, and effectively quit the band mid-performance. In the immediate aftermath of the Liverpool show, Jon Lord and Ian Pace, the 2 men who had been there since the very first rehearsal in 1968, sat in a stark concrete dressing room. They listened to the chaos filtering through the walls, the shouts of the crew, the complaints of the promoters, the erratic behavior of their bandmates. The realization was absolute and clinical. The Deep Purple brand was no longer a musical entity. It was a liability. The corporate machine had finally extracted the last ounce of viable material. Lord and Pace made a quiet, unilateral decision. They did not inform management, they did not call a band meeting, and they did not consult Coverdale, Hughes, or Bolin. They simply looked at each other and agreed, it's over. The execution of Deep Purple was swift and silent. They ordered the crew to pack the equipment, they canceled the remaining contracts, and they walked away. There was no grand public announcement, no farewell press conference. The heaviest band in the world simply bled out in a backstage room in Liverpool. However, the cessation of the touring machine did not halt the tragic trajectory it had set in motion. While Lord, Pace, and Coverdale retreated to rehabilitate and eventually rebuild their careers, Tommy Bolin was cast adrift. Tommy Bolin had been chewed up and spat out. At just 24, he was handed the impossible task of replacing a legend, subjected to intense hostility from ROM fans and forced to play through the agonizing pain of a paralyzed arm. The grueling tour didn't just break his spirit, it poured gasoline on his severe heroin addiction. When Deep Purple abruptly disbanded, they cut off his massive income but left him stranded with a raging multi-$100-a-day drug habit and a ruined reputation. He tried to start over, opening for Jeff Beck in late 1976, but his body was already giving out. In the early hours of December 4th, 1976, following a show in Miami, a lethal combination of heroin, alcohol, and barbiturates finally stopped his heart. He was only 25. Tommy Bolin wasn't a romanticized rock and roll casualty. He was a fragile kid thrown into a meat grinder that used up his talent, turned a blind eye to his addiction, and left him to die in a hotel room. Tommy Bolin's death was the most devastating tragedy of Deep Purple's 1970s run, but the nightmare didn't end when the band broke up. Deep Purple didn't just break bodies. The aftermath actively destroyed legacies, bankrupted founders, and left permanent scars on the survivors. The toxic fallout of their reign extended far beyond their final show. The trauma they endured was contagious, acting as invisible shackles that permanently reprogrammed the survivors. Rod Evans, the founding vocalist, was sued into bankruptcy by his former bandmates in 1980 and vanished entirely from the public record. Ian Gillan, physically drained and severely traumatized, fled into a 3-year silence, desperately but unsuccessfully trying to build a life outside the music industry. Those who remained in the business simply exported the toxicity. Ritchie Blackmore formed Rainbow, instituting a permanent state of paranoia and utilizing the same brutal, unexplained terminations he had perfected in Deep Purple. Even David Coverdale, who had fled the band in tears, fully internalized this cold-blooded executive power. When he formed Whitesnake, he systematically hired and fired musicians with ruthless detachment, eventually employing his former Deep Purple bosses, John Lord and Ian Pace, not as equal partners, but as contracted laborers. The machine had trained them all perfectly. The management of HEC Enterprises established a precedent where revenue generation superseded human biology. Internal communication was entirely replaced by legal threats and silent firings. The individuals generating the art were treated with less respect than the amplifiers they played through. Every single core member of the 1970s Deep Purple franchise walked away from the experience permanently scarred. Rod Evans was bankrupted and erased. Tommy Bolin was dead. Ian Gillan was physically drained and traumatized into a 3-year silence. Richie Blackmore had mutated into an isolated tyrant incapable of sustaining professional partnerships. Even the pragmatists, John Lord and Ian Pace, were forced to watch the brand they built degenerate into a punchline of drug-fueled chaos in places like Jakarta and Tokyo before unilaterally shutting off the life support. The ultimate tragedy of their legacy lies in the stark contrast between the art produced and the environment that produced it. Deep Purple's music was characterized by immense power, technical precision, and a sense of aggressive liberation. Yet, behind the curtain, the men executing that music were trapped in an environment defined by total powerlessness, deep-seated paranoia, and physical exploitation. As the 1970s drew to a close, the heavy metal genre that Deep Purple had helped birth was evolving. A new wave of British heavy metal bands was emerging, citing Deep Purple as their primary influence. But the veterans who had drawn the blueprint were either dead, in exile, or actively avoiding the monster they had created. The machine had been shut down, but the blueprints for that machine, the grueling schedules, the disposable band members, the prioritization of the brand over the human, were left behind, waiting for the next generation of management companies to adopt them. They created a genre of music that represented freedom, rebellion, and unbridled power to millions of teenagers across the globe. Yet to manufacture that sonic rebellion, the men of Deep Purple lived in a state of absolute subjugation. They bought their commercial immortality with their physical and mental health. For the loudest band in the world, the only rule that mattered was that the show must go on, no matter how many bodies were left backstage.